They say the person closest to you knows exactly where to twist the knife. For 30 years, Diana and I were inseparable. We weren't just business partners, we were sisters by choice. We built Aurelius Global from a dusty garage with 2 broken laptops and a dream that felt too big for the world to handle. I can still close my eyes and feel the grit of that garage on my fingertips. I remember the smell of burnt electrical wire and old paper, the dampness that seeped into our very bones during those long, brutal winter months in New Jersey, when we had nothing but a shared vision and a thermos of bitter coffee. We were 22, fearless, and utterly broke. I remember the cold nights when the wind would howl through the cracks in the garage door, making the single light bulb flicker like a dying star. We couldn't afford heating, so we wrapped ourselves in moth-eaten blankets, our breath coming out in white puffs as we stared at blue-tinted screens until our eyes bled and our fingers went numb. We shared everything in those days. We shared the last $10 in our bank account. We shared the cheap, chemical-tasting pizza that was our only meal for 3 days straight. But more importantly, we shared a pact, a silent agreement written in the sweat of our brows that no matter how high we climbed, we would never forget the floor we started on. When we made our first $100 profit, we didn't buy new clothes or go to a fancy restaurant. We sat on that greasy concrete floor, cranked up a battery-powered radio, and danced until we were breathless. That night, Diana looked at me with tears in her eyes and promised that we would be the queens of the world. I believed her. I believed in us. I believed that because I had carried her through the storms of those early years, she would always be the anchor that kept me grounded in the sunshine. But success is a strange poison. It doesn't kill you all at once. It just slowly changes the way you see the world. As Aurelius Global grew, the garage became a distant memory, replaced by a monolith of glass and steel that towered over the city. But as the building grew taller, Diana's perspective began to shift. It was subtle at first, like a slow-moving fog rolling in from the ocean. The higher we climbed, the thinner the air became, and the more it seemed to go to her head. She started to crave the aesthetic of success. She became the face of the company, the woman on the magazine covers, the one who loved the roar of applause at gala dinners while wearing $4,000 power suits. She traded her directness for corporate riddles and her old friends for strategic allies. I, on the other hand, stayed in the engine room. I was the one managing the complex logistics, the thousands of contracts, and the heartbeat of the employees who made Aurelius run. I didn't need the spotlight. I needed the work to be perfect. I thought my loyalty was my security. I truly believed that our history, the cold nights, the shared blankets, the struggles, was a shield that would protect our bond forever. I didn't see the predator in the room until it was too late. I didn't see Chloe. Chloe arrived like a breath of fresh yet clinical air. She was 25, sharp-edged, and smelled of expensive perfume and raw ambition. Officially, she was Diana's executive assistant, but she quickly became something far more dangerous, a gatekeeper. Chloe understood something about Diana that I had refused to acknowledge. Diana's ego had become a hungry ghost, and Chloe knew exactly how to feed it. Every time I brought a concern about long-term stability or ethical sourcing, Chloe would be there in the corner, tapping on her tablet, offering a modern counterpoint filled with buzzwords like disruptive growth and digital synergy. Slowly but surely, Chloe began to paint me as a relic of the past. She framed my caution as fear and my 30 years of wisdom as obsolescence. She convinced Diana that I was the anchor dragging the ship down rather than the keel keeping it steady. The lunches Diana and I used to share became formal strategy reviews on a calendar I no longer had access to. The late-night brainstorms were replaced by polished presentations that I wasn't invited to see. I felt the distance growing, a cold chasm opening between us, but I stayed quiet. I stayed observing, because even then, I knew every gear, every screw, and every hidden crack in the machine we had built. I watched as Diana began to believe the lies. I watched as she started looking at me not as a partner, but as a ghost she wanted to exorcise. She wanted to prove she was the sole genius behind the name Aurelius. She wanted to stand on the mountain peak alone, forgetting that I was the one who mapped the path and carried the supplies. The betrayal was already in motion, hidden behind polished smiles and corporate emails. Diana thought she was outgrowing me, but she failed to realize that when you cut the roots to make the tree look taller, the whole structure is destined to fall, and I was the only one who knew exactly where the first crack would appear. The second month of Chloe's presence in the executive suite felt like a long, slow-motion car crash I was powerless to stop. Every morning when I walked through those glass doors, the air felt thinner, the smiles from the staff more strained. Chloe didn't just manage Diana's schedule, she began to manage Diana's reality. She whispered in the hallways about outdated workflows and legacy baggage, making sure those words reached the ears of the younger, hungrier board members who didn't remember the garage in New Jersey. Diana, caught in a whirlwind of international galas and high-profile interviews, started looking at me not as the woman who shared her blankets, but as a reminder of a past she had outgrown. I remember one specific rainy Tuesday in November. I had spent all night reviewing the supply chain reports for our newest expansion into the Asian markets. I found a massive discrepancy, a shortcut Chloe had encouraged to save 20% on manufacturing costs. It was risky, unethical, and it threatened the very integrity of the Aurelius brand. I walked into Diana's office, the same office where we used to kick off our shoes and laugh about our early failures, but the atmosphere had changed. Diana was looking at a digital mock-up of a new magazine cover featuring her face, while Chloe stood behind her, adjusting the lighting on the screen like a devoted priestess. "Eleanor, we need to talk about the sourcing for the new Dawn project," I said, placing the printed reports on her marble desk. "These numbers don't add up. We're sacrificing quality for a quick margin. It's a mistake." Diana didn't even look up at first. She kept her eyes on the screen, admiring her own reflection. It was Chloe who spoke first, her voice a soft, condescending purr. "Eleanor, we've already discussed this in the strategy meeting. The market moves fast now. We can't afford to be bogged down by the traditional caution of the 90s. We need to be disruptive. We need to pivot." I looked at Diana, waiting for her to defend our shared values, but she simply sighed, a long, weary sound as if I were a difficult child. "She's right, Eleanor," Diana said, finally looking at me with eyes that felt like cold stones. "You're always looking for reasons to slow down. You're afraid of the height we've reached. Maybe the air is getting too thin for you up here?" That was the first time the knife twisted. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way she looked at Chloe for approval after saying them. My partner of 30 years was seeking validation from a girl who had been with us for 30 days. From that moment on, the isolation was systematic. My access to the main server was restricted for security upgrades. My weekly meetings with the department heads were rescheduled and then canceled. I became a ghost in my own empire. I watched from the sidelines as Diana, fueled by Chloe's flattery, began a series of aggressive acquisitions that made the stock price soar but hollowed out the company's actual value. They were building a house of cards on a foundation of ego, and they were so blinded by the flash blubs of the paparazzi that they couldn't see the cracks starting to form in the glass. The day of the betrayal finally arrived in the middle of a cold, gray December. I was summoned to the grand boardroom, a room I designed to represent transparency and strength. But today, the long mahogany table felt like an altar for a sacrifice. Diana was sitting at the head, flanked by Chloe and a group of young, expensive-looking lawyers I didn't recognize. There was no coffee, no small talk, and no warmth. The board members I had hired, mentored, and protected were all staring at their tablets, refusing to meet my eyes. I knew then that the decision had been made long before I walked through the door. "Eleanor," Diana began, her voice practiced and professional, devoid of any hint of our shared history. "The board has decided that Aurelius Global needs to move in a new direction, a more agile direction. We've conducted a comprehensive review of our leadership structure, and it's become clear that your role is no longer aligned with our future vision. We're offering you a graceful exit, a generous retirement package in exchange for your resignation and a non-compete agreement. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't even act surprised. I simply looked at the woman across from me, the woman who had once promised we would never forget the floor we started on. I saw the triumph in Chloe's eyes, a sharp, predatory glint. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully removed the only person who could see through her games. Diana handed me a leather-bound folder containing the dismissal papers, her hand steady, her smile a cold corporate mask. "I won't be signing the non-compete, Diana," I said softly, my voice echoing in the vast, silent room. Chloe chuckled, a small, irritating sound. "Eleanor, be reasonable. You're 55. You're a relic of a different era. Take the money and enjoy your garden. You've had a good run." I didn't look at Chloe. I kept my gaze fixed on Diana. "You think you're cutting off a dead branch, Diana, but you forgot one crucial detail. I'm not a branch. I'm the soil. I'm the one who knows where every secret is buried, every illegal shortcut Chloe has encouraged, and every cent you've over-leveraged to fund this new direction." I stood up, leaving the folder unopened on the table. I didn't take my personal ethics. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out of that boardroom with an unnatural calm because I knew something they didn't. I knew that for 10 years I had been quietly preparing for this day. I knew about the Blue Marble Group. I knew that every time Diana had issued new shares to pay for her lavish parties and Chloe's consulting fees, I had been the one buying them up through dozens of different shell companies. Diana thought she was firing an employee. She didn't realize she was declaring war on her own majority shareholder. The storm was coming, and I was the one who had built the lightning rod. The 30 days following my exit from Aurelius Global were the quietest and most calculated days of my life. I didn't go home to cry or garden, as Chloe had mockingly suggested. I went to a small, windowless office I had rented under a shell company name 3 years ago, a place Diana didn't know existed. While the world watched Diana grace the cover of yet another business magazine, celebrating her bold new direction and her agile leadership, I was sitting in front of 6 monitors, watching the digital lifeblood of our empire begin to leak. I wasn't just a founder. I was the one who had written the original algorithms for our logistics. I knew every back door, every fail-safe, and every hidden weakness in the system. Back at the tower, the atmosphere was shifting from celebration to a frantic, silent panic. Chloe had officially taken over my old office, redecorating it in cold chrome and white leather, but she quickly realized that looking like an executive and being one were 2 very different things. Without my oversight, the new Dawn project, the one Chloe had pushed for with its cheap, unethical sourcing, hit its first major wall. A shipment of raw materials was seized at the border because the paperwork, which I used to double-check personally, was riddled with errors. Millions of dollars were sitting in a shipping container in the sweltering heat, and Diana was too busy at a charity gala in Paris to answer her phone. I watched through the internal server logs as Chloe tried to bypass the security protocols I had put in place years ago. She was trying to move funds from our long-term reserve accounts to cover the mounting daily losses, but every time she tried, the system would flag it for manual partner authorization, and since I was no longer a partner in her eyes, there was no one left to authorize the theft. She was trapped in a digital maze I had built to protect the company from people exactly like her. The irony was a bitter medicine, and I made sure she swallowed every drop. By the second week, our oldest clients, the ones who had been with us since the garage, started to smell the rot. These were men and women who didn't care about digital synergy or disruptive pivoting. They cared about the fact that their calls weren't being returned and their orders were arriving late and damaged. One of our biggest investors, a man who had trusted me with his family's fortune for 20 years, called the office demanding to speak with me. Chloe, in her infinite arrogance, told him that I was no longer relevant to the company's future. That single sentence cost Aurelius Global $50 million in withdrawn investments by the following morning. Diana returned from Paris to a burning house. The stock price, which had been artificially inflated by Chloe's aggressive marketing, began to shudder. The board members, who had been so silent and complicit during my firing, now were screaming at each other in the hallways. They saw their personal net worth evaporating as the New Dawn project turned into a public relations nightmare. Rumors of the unethical sourcing began to leak to the press, leaks that I had carefully timed to hit the major news cycles when the company was at its most vulnerable. Chloe's response was to double down on the deception. She convinced Diana to issue another round of emergency stock, a Series D offering, to raise the cash needed to pay off the angry vendors and hide the losses from the quarterly report. This was exactly what I had been waiting for. This was the trap I had set 10 years ago when I first noticed Diana's growing vanity. As the new shares hit the market at a desperate discount, the Blue Marble Group, my shadow investment firm, was there to catch every single one of them. We bought them through brokers in London, Tokyo, and Zurich, moving so quietly that not even the most eagle-eyed analyst noticed the pattern. On a Tuesday evening, exactly 45 days after I had walked out with my small box of belongings, I received a notification on my private terminal. The Blue Marble Group now held 51.2% of the voting shares of Aurelius Global. I wasn't just an anchor anymore. I was the captain, the owner, and the storm itself. I looked at the photo of Diana and I in the garage, the one I had kept on my desk for 30 years, and I felt a deep, hollow sadness. I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted to save the dream we had built from the monster she had become. I picked up the phone and made one call, not to Diana, but to the head of security at the tower, a man I had hired when his wife was sick and his bank account was empty, a man who knew exactly who had built the foundation he stood on. "John," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I'm coming in tomorrow morning. I'll need the boardroom cleared and the executive elevators locked. And tell Diana and Chloe that the majority shareholder is coming for a visit. It's time to settle the books." The stage was set for the final reckoning. Diana thought she'd erased me, but she had only made me more powerful by forcing me into the shadows. She had forgotten that the most dangerous part of an iceberg isn't the tip that glitters in the sun. It's the massive silent weight beneath the surface that can tear a ship apart without a sound. Tomorrow, the sun would rise on a very different Aurelius Global, and for the first time in 30 years, Diana would have to face the truth without a blanket to hide under. The morning of the reckoning, the city was draped in a cold gray mist, the kind of weather that makes the glass towers look like ghosts standing in a graveyard of ambition. I arrived at the Aurelius Global Tower exactly at 9 a.m. I didn't wear a power suit or expensive diamonds to show my status. I wore a simple dark navy trench coat and carried a single leather folder. As I stepped through the revolving doors, the lobby went silent. It was a silence I had earned through 30 years of building this place from the mud. The security guards, men who had been told I was no longer relevant, stood at attention as I passed. John, the head of security, gave me a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that the true owner had returned to the throne. The private elevator ride to the 50th floor took exactly 45 seconds. In those seconds, I thought about the garage. I thought about the cold pizza, the shared blankets, and the way Diana used to laugh when our first prototype actually worked. I felt a pang of grief for the friend I had lost, but it was quickly replaced by the cold clarity of the mission. The doors opened, and the executive floor was a hive of frantic energy. Staff members were running between offices with stacks of legal documents, their faces etched with the fear of an empire about to collapse. They stopped in their tracks when they saw me, their eyes wide as if they were seeing a ghost. I walked straight to the boardroom doors. I didn't knock. I didn't wait for an assistant to announce me. I simply pushed them open and walked into the lion's den. The room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and cheap desperation. Diana was sitting at the head of the table, her hair perfectly coiffed, but her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Chloe was pacing behind her, her voice shrill as she shouted into a smartphone about market manipulation and short-selling attacks. They both froze when they saw me standing in the doorway. Eleanor? What the hell are you doing here? Diana's voice was a mixture of rage and a burgeoning hidden terror. I had security escorted you out once, and I'll do it again. You're trespassing on private property. This meeting is for shareholders only. I didn't say a word at first. I simply walked to the other end of the long mahogany table, the seat directly opposite her, and sat down. I placed my leather folder on the polished wood with a heavy, deliberate thud. You're right about one thing, Diana. This meeting is for shareholders only, and as the representative of the Blue Marble Group, I hold 51.2% of the voting rights of this company. That makes me the majority shareholder, and that makes this my property. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the hum of the air conditioning 50 floors below. Diana's face went from an angry red to a sickly hollow white in a matter of seconds. Chloe stopped pacing, her smartphone slipping from her hand and hitting the carpet with a dull sound. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. I slid the leather folder across the table toward Diana. Inside were the documents proving my ownership, the digital receipts of every share I'd bought while they were busy celebrating my exit. You thought I was the anchor dragging you down, Diana, but you forgot that an anchor is the only thing that keeps a ship from being torn apart by the storm. You traded 30 years of loyalty for 3 months of flattery from a girl who was already packing her bags to join Vanguard Zenith. I have the emails, Chloe. I know about the trade secrets you've been leaking to our rivals in exchange for a vice president position at their firm. You weren't here to build Diana's vision. You were here to strip the copper from the walls while the house was burning. Diana looked at Chloe, her eyes filled with a sudden, devastating realization. She looked back at the papers in front of her, the reality of her total collapse finally sinking in. Her empire was gone. Her reputation was in tatters, and the only person who could have saved her was the one she had cast aside like a piece of legacy baggage. She tried to find her voice, her hand shaking as she touched the edge of the mahogany table we'd picked out together. Eleanor? I didn't know. I thought we were moving forward. I thought I was doing what was best for the company. You were doing what was best for your ego, Diana. You forgot the garage. You forgot the floor we started on. You wanted to be a queen, but you forgot that a queen is nothing without the people who build her crown. As of this moment, Chloe is terminated for cause, effective immediately. Security is waiting outside to escort her from the building. And as for you, Diana, you have a choice. You can sign over your remaining shares and retire with whatever dignity you have left, or we can go to court and let the world see the fraud you've been hiding to cover your losses. The clock is ticking, and for once, I'm the one handing out the grocery list. I watched as Chloe was let out by John and his team, her arrogance replaced by a frantic, ugly sobbing. She had played the game and lost, and now she was nothing more than a footnote in a much larger story. Diana sat alone at the head of the table, a broken woman in a glass tower. I didn't feel the joy of vengeance. I felt the heavy responsibility of a builder who has to clear away the rubble before the new foundation can be laid. The sun began to break through the mist outside, casting long golden shadows across the room. The era of Aurelius Global as a vanity project was over. The era of the employees, the builders, and the quiet architects was about to begin. The silence that followed Chloe's forced exit was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a grave. It was the clean, hollow silence that follows a great storm. Diana sat at the head of the mahogany table, her hand still resting on the polished surface, as if she were afraid the floor might suddenly vanish beneath her. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, shrunken by the weight of her own deceptions and the cold realization that the person she had cast aside was the only thing that had been keeping her afloat. I didn't move. I didn't offer her a tissue or a comforting word. I simply waited for the reality of her choices to finish its work. I thought I was protecting us, Diana whispered, her voice so thin it barely reached across the table. Chloe said the old ways were dead. She said you were looking back and that I needed to look forward. I wanted Aurelius Global to be the biggest in the world, Eleanor. I wanted our names to be carved in the sky forever. I didn't see that I was carving them into a tombstone. I looked at the window where the sun was now burning through the gray mist, making the glass towers of the city glitter like diamonds. Success isn't about being the biggest, Diana. It's about being the strongest, and strength doesn't come from a magazine cover or a viral marketing campaign. It comes from the people who believe in you when the lights are off. You forgot the garage. You forgot that we didn't start with a skyscraper. We started with a promise. And when you broke that promise, you broke the foundation of everything we built. I pushed the final document toward her, the one that would officially transition Aurelius Global into an employee-owned trust. I wasn't taking the company back to run it as a dictator. I was giving it back to the hands that actually built it, the thousands of men and women who stayed late, who worked through their weekends, and who believed in a dream that Diana had turned into a vanity project. By signing this, Diana would relinquish her title, her office, and her ego, but she would keep her freedom. It was the most expensive lesson she would ever buy, and it was the only way to save the soul of our empire. Diana picked up the pen, the expensive gold one that Chloe had bought for her, and looked at it with a strange expression of distaste. She set it aside and reached into the drawer of the boardroom table, pulling out a plain black plastic pen that an intern had left behind. She signed the papers with a hand that shook at first, then became steady as the last of her illusions fell away. As she scrawled her name, the blue neon letters of Aurelius Global on the building's exterior seemed to dim in my mind. The era of the celebrity CEO was over. The era of the architect had returned. I didn't stay to watch her pack. I didn't want to see her gather the awards and the photos that had become hollow trophies. I walked out of the boardroom, through the executive suite where the staff were already starting to breathe again, and down to the lobby. John, the head of security, was standing by the revolving doors. He didn't say anything. He just gave me a respectful nod and opened the door. I stepped out into the crisp, early morning air of New York City, and for the first time in 30 years, the sky didn't feel like something I had to conquer. It felt like something I could finally enjoy. I didn't keep the majority of the liquidated assets for myself. I didn't need a villa in France or a yacht in the Mediterranean. I kept enough to live a quiet, comfortable life, and the rest I funneled into the Blue Marble Foundation, an organization dedicated to funding small, women-led startups that were being crowded out by the corporate vultures. I wanted to find the next two girls in a dusty garage and give them the shield they would need to survive the sunshine of success. I wanted to make sure that loyalty and integrity were no longer just buzzwords, but the very currency of their growth. I am Eleanor, and I am no longer the engine room of someone else's dream. I am the architect of my own horizon, and for the first time, the view is absolutely perfect.